clear across the southeast, but sunny for many today, a high of 11 Celsius.
LBC Travel, I'm Joanne Webb. The M23 remains closed southbound between the M25 and Junction 9 at Gatwick Airport, and that's because the investigation works do continue. Also, for those who need to make a journey, there are problems on the Chiswick High Road, which is part of the South Circular Road. Very slow southbound to Kew Bridge because of the emergency repair works. Also very busy in Charles Hill on the A41, Finchley Road in both directions to Hendon Way, and that's because of a burst water main. And on the Underground, there are now severe delays on the Hammersmith and City line because of a shortage of trains.
This is LBC. Nick Ferrari now. 0345 6060 973 LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8 before 8 is the time. OK, for parents, pupils and teachers alike, let's learn more of how these exams will function this summer from Conservative MP and School Standards Minister Nick Gibb, who joins me now. Morning, Minister. It's been a while. I trust you and your family are well. Thank you for joining me this morning. Tell me how the GCSEs and A-levels will run this year.
Well, we had to take the difficult decision of cancelling exams because we felt that this year, given the pandemic and given the disruption students had faced up and down the country, that it wouldn't be fair for those exams to go ahead. But we wanted to make sure that young people could move on to the next phase of their education. So we have a teacher-assessed grade. So the teacher who knows their pupils best, using her or his professionalism, to award the grade to those students on the basis of a range of evidence of the work that they've conducted over the last couple of years of the course. There'll be very careful guidance issued to teachers about how to construct those grades with training. There'll be a quality assurance process at the school level. Every grade will be signed off by the head teacher. There'll be quality assurances processed by the exam boards as well, once those grades have been submitted on a sample basis and on a risk basis, just to make sure that there is consistency and fairness in how those grades have been assessed and submitted.
I've heard the word,
and then the grades will be.
Okay, I've heard the word fairness a couple of times. I don't need to tell you and your colleagues it's not a fair system currently, in that some pupils will have benefited from, I won't say not disrupted education, but teachers going with Zoom classes and Skypes and goodness knows what else. And other children perhaps have not been in as much benefit as they might have been in a perfect world. How fair is it that one child won't have been taught as much as the person sitting next to him or her?
Exactly, and that's why we cancelled exams. It's why we've moved to this system. And the assessment that the teacher makes will only be on what the student has been taught. It will not be on what they have not been taught. And that's very clear in the approach we're taking, so that it will be fair. A method of judging those students.
So then we come to the idea that we will have voluntary exams. Can you confirm that to be the case?
Yes, so this is another piece of evidence that the teacher can rely on if they wish. So the exam boards are producing a question bank of questions from past papers, some new questions, some to amalgam of questions that teachers can select to give to their students to take, on the basis of what they've actually taught those students. And it'll be just one more piece of evidence that the teacher can use, but it will be optional for teachers to use it. But it's a very useful piece of evidence that teachers can use in order to provide a backing for why they've come to a particular grade decision for those students.
Why should a teacher opt for an exam, or vice versa? Why should he or she not opt for an exam? What would be the criteria you would suggest, Minister?
Well, it's up to those students, up to those teachers to decide.
I think that's probably going to be a no, in all honesty, if it's up to the students, Minister.
Yes, no students like exams, but they look at the evidence that they have, the mock exams they might have done, substantial essays that they've written, and so on in class work, and they can, if they wish to, they can have this additional piece of evidence that they can use if they wish, and I suspect that many teachers will use it. These are question banks produced by the exam boards with mark schemes attached to them and exemplar pieces of work that demonstrate what the grade should be. So it's a very useful tool for teachers. But we are clear, we consulted on this question about whether it should be mandatory or optional, and there's a very clear response that it should be an optional tool for teachers.
How will you guard against what's called grade inflation, Minister?
Yes, that's obviously always a concern, and that's why there are these quality assurance processes in place, both at the school level and at the exam board level. But our priority is to make sure that every young person can move on to the next stage of their career, whether that's to college or to university or to an apprenticeship, and not have that disrupted by what's happened with the pandemic. And that's always been our overriding objective.
But you have got teachers marking their own homework effectively, and then the head rubber stamping it, haven't you, if they don't go for the exam system?
Yes, but those quality assurance processes are important, and the exam boards will make sure that every school has those processes in place, and they will sample check the grades once they're submitted, and those schools that do submit grades that are way out of kilter with the previous results of that school, that will be a trigger for the exam boards to go and investigate that school and have a look at what the evidence is for those grades to make sure that they are right.
You and your colleagues have clearly put in a lot of work, and you know far more than I do on this subject. I wonder if I can turn to Sir John Coles, who was Director General of the Department of Education, who was on the Ofqual committee advising on exams, who's now resigned, saying that actually this year possibly will be worse than last. He has no confidence in what you and your colleagues have put together. Why would that be?
Well, I've known Sir John for many years, and he's a very accomplished educationalist.
Right.
But there are differing views.
So if he's accomplished, that should worry you even more, Minister. If he's an accomplished educationist, I quote that he says, this risks an outcome much worse than last year. You and your colleagues have done it again, haven't you? It's another school shambles.
No, that's his judgment. There are many judgments of very other accomplished educationists who think otherwise. We work very closely with the regulator. They support this system. We wanted to make sure that this was just another piece of evidence. We didn't want there to be an exam by the back door if it was mandatory. That was the fear, because we've already taken the decision that exams would not be fair this year. And so we didn't want to simply replace exams with another exam. But this is a tool available to teachers to add to the range of evidence they've already got to make sure that the grade that's being awarded by the exam boards to those students is as fair and representative of the actual attainment and work of those students, but only on what they've been taught, not on what they have not been taught.
And that makes any appeal very difficult, doesn't it, Minister? Because if a young man or woman appeals, whoever hears the appeal has then got to determine how much of the syllabus he or she had actually been exposed to. Do you see where I'm driving at?
Well, what they will do, the first stage of the appeal is to the school to make sure the processes were right, no mistakes made. Then if the student's still unhappy, they appeal to the exam board. They will then look at that evidence that the teacher has compiled and compare it to the grade, and to make sure that was a reasonable exercise of academic judgment in coming to those grades. And if they feel that it is not, then they will change the grade, and the grade can go up or it can go down as a consequence of that appeal.
A bit embarrassing, though, isn't it? A bit embarrassing. Sir John Coles says it'll be worse than last year's hated algorithms.
Well, here's one opinion. We consulted very widely. There were 100,000 responses to the consultation process, half of them from students, but many from teachers. With the teacher unions, the ASCL, Jeff Barton, another very accomplished educationist, very supportive of this approach. I think it is the fairest approach. Okay. The best system, Nick, is exams, frankly, in a normal year. But this is not a normal year. We've had disruption to children's education up and down the country, varying disruption. So to be fair, a teacher-assessed grade is a far better system this year alone than exams. And finally, hopefully we move away from that in a couple of weeks' time, and actually less than a couple of weeks' time, pupils in England will be returning to their schools, and that begins as, of course, March the 8th. Can you clarify, I've had questions from my listeners, do pupils have to wear masks at all times in school? Then it's not mandatory, but we highly recommend secondary schools to ensure that students in a classroom where you can't have social distancing, that they do wear masks. We're doing everything we can to minimise the risk of transmission of the virus within the school environment. Ventilation, the hygiene issues, the staggered lunch breaks, the bubbles, so they're not unnecessarily mixing with people they don't need to mix with. All those measures are designed to make the school environment as safe as possible. Well, I wonder if I can remind you, this is your boss, the Prime Minister, speaking a few months ago.
Face coverings in those types of areas outside the classroom, but not in the classroom.
In school corridors.
Face coverings in those types of areas outside the classroom, but not in the classroom, because that's clearly nonsensical. You can't teach with face coverings, and you can't expect people to learn with face coverings.
I'm confused. A few months ago, the Prime Minister described it as nonsensical. Now you're saying it's advised. Where do I go with this, Minister? Yes, we have to move with... Well, we did have masks in the communal corridors to make sure that when the Prime Minister says it's nonsensical for teachers. It is more challenging. No, not more challenging. Nonsensical. Well, it is more challenging to teach when you have masks on the children and on the teachers. But we have a new variant of this virus. This is far more transmissible than the previous variant. We're always led in every decision we take by the advice from the Chief Medical Officer, by SAGE, by the scientists, to do everything we can to minimise the risk. And on top of that, of course, Nick, we have the twice-weekly testing. But that's not mandatory either, is it? Pupils don't have to submit for testing, do they?
They do not, but again, we highly recommend it. And it's a way of identifying people that have the virus who don't show symptoms, and it's a way of protecting other students and teachers in the school. We hope that every student.
I appreciate
will
you.
want to
Lastly,
take
you
this
can't
test.
be in every classroom. I appreciate that, but there's nothing to stop parents not allowing their children to have these tests, and those children then mixing with parents whose children quite rightly are having the tests. I mean, surely that destroys. It should be no test, no school, shouldn't it?
No, we want to make sure that it's not compulsory in that sense. And they will need the permission of the parents. And in all these things, it's a balance of risk. And this is just having anybody testing, frankly, and identifying asymptomatic cases is a bonus in terms of minimizing the risk. But we do expect and we hope that most students, the vast majority of students, will volunteer to have these tests twice a week. And then after the third test, there'll be home testing kits for those students. And again, it's a way of protecting one another from the transmission of the virus in the school environment.
Grateful for your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed. School Standards Minister Nick Gibb appearing here on LBC. We're at 3 minutes after 8. It's news time with Thomas Watts.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, ministers have announced plans aimed at avoiding a repeat of last year's exams fiasco in England. Teachers will be given wide flexibility to determine